I still see that circle of broken concrete in my sleep, the way the afternoon sun slid along the jagged edges, turning dust into a thin, drifting veil. There was a hollow, breathless quiet when the last piece of the slab shifted and the black mouth of that well opened, exhaling air that smelled of rust and damp stone. A work glove lay abandoned on the rim, streaked with gray cement and red dirt, fingers curled toward the darkness like it was pointing down. Someone's flashlight beam trembled as it searched the depths, catching on the slick stones and something pale that flashed, then disappeared back into shadow. The generators hummed in the background, throwing a harsh white glare over weeds that had grown tall and brittle around the old bricks. Metal clanged once sharply when a crowbar slipped, and then all at once the men fell silent as if the noise had woken something they didn't want to see. The evening wind moved across the fields, hot and dry, but that hole in the ground felt cold from where I stood at the fence line watching the past being dragged up into the light. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back before any of that, before the floodlights and the tape and the trucks, Mesa Creek was just a tired little town where the days blurred together under the same wide, unforgiving sky. Summers came in like someone had turned the oven on and forgotten about it. The air shimmered over the highway, and the metal swings at the park burned your hands if you weren't careful. In the mornings, you could hear the low rumble of pickup trucks heading out before sunrise tires crunching over gravel and the soft hiss of sprinklers trying to keep yellowing lawns alive. The smell of dust and diesel hung around the main road, mixing with the faint sweetness from the bakery that opened at 5 a.m. sharp. That was the world I knew, the world I thought I understood, a place where you waved at the same faces every day and thought that meant you were safe. My days back then followed a simple rhythm that felt solid like the steady tick of the old clock in our kitchen. I'd get up before the heat settled in when the air still held a trace of cool from the night and put on a pot of coffee, listening to the drip and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Light would ease in through the thin curtains, turning the countertops a warm gold, while Mark's boots thudded softly down the hallway. He always smelled faintly of motor oil and soap, even fresh out of the shower, and when he kissed my cheek on his way out, I could hear the jingle of wrenches in his truck as he pulled away. The screen door creaked and slapped shut behind him, a sound that was just part of the house like breathing. In those moments our life felt modest but complete. One kid, one paycheck, one old house holding us all together. Evan's mornings were slower, stretched out like the shadows in his room when the sun started climbing. His door usually stayed half open, a dusty poster of some mountain range curling at the corners above his bed. I remember the way the fan in his room rattled on hot days, stirring the smell of laundry detergent and that faint sharp note of bicycle chain grease he always seemed to bring in with him. He was 18 that summer, taller than me by half a head, but he moved through the house like he was trying not to take up too much space. Most days I'd tap lightly on his doorframe and see one long arm thrown over his face hair sticking up the soft glow from his alarm clock, blinking a time he'd clearly ignored. The cicadas outside would already be buzzing by then, their steady chorus seeping through the thin walls, while I nudged him awake and set a plate on the table. He wasn't a talkative kid, not first thing in the morning. He'd sit at the kitchen table with one knee pulled up barefoot, hooked on the rung of the chair, poking at scrambled eggs, while the radio murmured farm reports and country songs in the background. The light coming through the window would catch the faint freckles across his nose and the little scar along his chin from when he fell off the porch steps at 8. When he did speak, his voice was softer than you'd expect from a boy his size. Careful somehow, like he was still deciding how much of himself to show. Sometimes he'd mention a movie he wanted to see with Jason, or a new trail he'd heard about near the canyon, or the book they'd assigned for English next year. Small things, ordinary things, clinking against the side of his glass as he finished his orange juice. Mesa Creek itself moved in slow circles, the same scenes looping day after day under that pale, harsh sun. By mid-morning, heat waves rolled off the asphalt on Main Street, making the Dollar Saver sign look like it was melting. The bell at the hardware store jingled whenever somebody pushed through the door, bringing in a gust of warm air that smelled like hot pavement and cigarette smoke from the ashtray out front. Inside, the aisles smelled of fertilizer, lumber, and those little rubber seals that always left a faint chemical tang on your fingers. When school was in session, I'd be over at the elementary office answering phones and sorting paperwork, the buzz of fluorescent lights above me, and the squeak of sneakers down the hallway. That summer, with school out the building, sat mostly quiet, and my days at home were filled with the softer sounds of laundry tumbling a lawnmower starting up 3 houses down, and the steady hum of the box fan in our living room trying its best against the heat. The canyon sat just outside town, past the last cluster of houses and the rusted water tower like a secret that was too big to hide. The road out there turned from cracked pavement to packed red dirt, and when a truck passed by, it kicked up a tail of dust that hung in the air long after the vehicle disappeared. I can still see the way the land broke open there, the flat plain giving way to layered rock and dry stream beds, thorny brush clinging to the edges as if the earth had been peeled back. On hot days, heat rose from the rocks in shimmering sheets, the air carrying the smell of sun-baked stone and dry grass. That canyon was where local kids went to take pictures, to drink cheap beer they hoped their parents wouldn't smell, to sit beneath the old windmill and feel like the world was a little bigger than Mesa Creek. For Evan, it was more than a backdrop. It was a place where his mind seemed to quiet, where the noise of school halls and small-town gossip couldn't quite reach. He wasn't like a lot of the other boys his age, and that was something I noticed even before I understood why it made me nervous. He didn't care much about football games or loud parties out on gravel roads. When the stadium lights came on in the fall and the whole town smelled like popcorn and dust, Evan would sometimes stay home stretched out on the couch with a book, the glow of the TV flickering quietly in the corner. He rode his bike instead of asking for the old family car, even when the afternoons were hot enough to make the handlebars burn your palms. I'd watch him from the kitchen window, his shoulders set, his backpack pulled tight against his spine as he coasted down our street with that red dust catching on his tires. Once in a while, I'd try to nudge him toward more people, more noise. Invite Jason over, I'd say, or go to the diner with the others, but he'd just give me a small lopsided smile and say he was fine. Jason showed up enough that I came to recognize the sound of his truck before I saw it, that particular rattle in the muffler, and the crunch of his tires grinding our gravel driveway. He was one of those boys who filled a space as soon as he stepped into it. Dusty boots, old ball cap, the easy smell of sweat and gasoline that followed him in from the day. In our kitchen, he'd lean against the counter, sipping whatever soda I had in the fridge, and talk about nothing and everything. What Mr. Connor said in history, how terrible the cafeteria pizza was, the time he and Evan saw a rattlesnake sunning itself on the canyon trail. His voice was always just a little too loud for the small room, bouncing off the cabinets while the fan rattled above us. I watched the way Evan relaxed around him, shoulders loosening, smile coming quicker, and I was grateful for that friendship, even if I didn't always understand their love of cliffs and abandoned places. Out beyond the canyon, a little farther down a different dirt road, sat Harper Farm, or what was left of it. By 2010, it was hardly a farm anymore, just a few leaning barns, some rusted metal tanks, and a house whose windows had gone dark years before. Folks in town talked about it the way people talk about a sore tooth they don't really want to prod. Older men at the diner would stir their coffee and mention how kids had no business poking around those old buildings, how the ground out there hid more holes than it showed. The stories were mostly harmless on the surface, about a well that went down farther than anyone could measure, about cattle that spooked if they got too close to a certain patch of ground. Sometimes on late summer nights when the air smelled like dust and cooling asphalt, kids would whisper that you could drop a rock out there and never hear it hit bottom. I heard those stories the way mothers do, half dismissing them, half filing them away in a corner of my mind that tightened my chest just a little. That summer felt hotter than the ones before it, though. Maybe that's just how memory works when you look back through grief. The sky seemed to bleach out earlier in the day, turning from soft blue to a hard pale white that made you squint when you stepped outside. The hum of air conditioners became the soundtrack of our evenings, and every porch seemed to have a box fan propped in the doorway dragging warm air across worn wooden floors. The smell of cut grass mixed with charcoal from backyard grills, and somewhere on our street, a dog would start barking at nothing in particular sound, carrying thin and lonely across the open yards. Inside our house, the linoleum in the kitchen kept its cool longer than the rest of the rooms, and I'd find myself standing there barefoot, hands in dishwater, listening to the muffled thump of Evan's music through his bedroom wall. Looking back, there were tiny moments that didn't feel like warning signs, then just little flickers of something unsettled beneath the ordinary. The way Evan would stare out the window a second longer than usual after dinner, his fingers drumming lightly on the glass as the sun dropped behind the derelict grain elevator. The slight edge that crept into Mark's voice when talk at the diner turned to budget cuts to the sheriff's office running thin and the nearest backup sitting 2 counties away. The night Jason mentioned almost offhand that he'd heard some of the younger kids had been sneaking out toward Harper Farm again, his eyes flicking to me and away as he took a long pull from his soda. The air in the room had felt a little heavier, then the whir of the refrigerator suddenly loud in the silence that followed. On the day everything finally shifted, though I didn't know it yet, the morning started like any other July day in Mesa Creek. The sun was already bright by 7, gilding the dust on the windowsills and drawing sharp lines across the kitchen table. The air smelled faintly of coffee and toast, and outside you could hear a lawnmower coughing to life somewhere down the block. Evan came in wearing that old gray t-shirt he liked, the one with a faded bike logo across the front, his hair still damp from a quick rinse at the bathroom sink. Sweat beaded at the back of his neck almost as soon as he stepped outside, and he wiped it away with the heel of his hand, leaving a streak of dust along his jaw. He told me he might ride out for a while after the worst of the heat passed, not saying exactly where, just that familiar easy, out a bit mom. That evening, the light lingered longer than it seemed to have any right to, hanging in the sky like it didn't want to let go. The cicadas were already loud in the mesquite trees, their buzz rising and falling in waves that pressed against the screen door. I remember standing at the sink, the cool porcelain under my fingers, listening for the distant rattle of a bicycle on our street, that thin metallic whine of wheels spinning over loose gravel. The porch light clicked on as the sky turned from orange to deep, dusty purple, its cone of yellow pooling on the front steps and catching the fine powder of red dirt on the welcome mat. The house felt unusually still, the fan in the living room ticking softly as it turned, pushing warm air around the same empty rooms. I dried my hands on a dish towel and glanced toward the road again, just as another car passed, without slowing its headlights, sweeping across our front windows and then fading, leaving the yard a little too quiet and the porch light burning on a little longer than it should have. By the time the porch light had been burning for its second hour, I kept telling myself that nothing was wrong, that in a town like ours, a boy could be late without it meaning a thing. Still, the quiet had a different weight to it that night, heavier than dust settling after a long day. I stepped outside, letting the screen door tap shut behind me, and the warm air pressed close against my skin. Our street looked the same as it always did at dusk. Mailboxes casting soft shadows, a sprinkler sputtering 2 houses down. But something in the stillness felt off, like the town was holding its breath. I tried calling Evan's phone again, listening to it ring out into a void I couldn't imagine, the faint hum of the porch bulb filling the silence when the line finally clicked to voicemail. I stood there on the front steps, rubbing my thumb across the edge of the rail, reminding myself that teenagers lose track of time, that bikes break chains, that sunsets run together when you're young. But the truth was already settling in my stomach, cold and unwelcome, before I had the courage to name it. Inside the house felt too big without him. The ticking clock above the stove seemed louder than usual, each second landing like a drip of water in an empty sink. I paced between the kitchen window and the living room, glancing out at the road, as though any moment I'd see the familiar shape of his bike appear at the bend. When Mark came home, wiping grease from his hands with an old shop rag, he took one look at me and set the rag down, unmoving on the counter. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't have to. The way my voice caught when I told him Evan wasn't back said enough. He checked the garage first, as if the simple act of seeing the empty space where the bike belonged might clear the fog. He ran his hand along the workbench, the scent of oil and sun-warmed wood rising as he moved past. Then he stepped outside and scanned the street the way a man does when he's looking for signs the rest of the world can't see. At first, he tried to stay casual, telling me to give it a little more time, but every few minutes his eyes would drift toward the darkening sky, and I could see the worry tightening around his jaw. When the sun finally dropped behind the grain elevator, leaving only a thin band of orange along the horizon, he grabbed his flashlight and keys. I followed him to the truck gravel crunching under our feet, the smell of hot metal rising from the hood where it had baked in the sun all afternoon. I asked if he wanted me to come along, but he shook his head. "I'll check the usual spots," he said in a voice that tried to stay steady. "If he's out there, I'll find him." The truck's engine groaned, awake headlights sweeping across our front yard in two pale arcs. I watched him drive off until the dust settled back to the earth and the hum of the engine faded. While he was gone, I kept the front curtains open, my phone in hand. Outside, the cicadas had settled into their rhythm, a steady buzz rising from the trees that made the quiet between my missed calls feel even deeper. I tried Jason's number on instinct. Maybe Evan had stopped by his place. Maybe the boys had gotten caught up in something that made them forget the time. Jason's phone rang twice before his mother answered, her voice soft, surprised to hear from me. No, she hadn't seen him. No, Jason wasn't with him. She paused for a moment, that pause people make when they sense something underneath your words, and then asked me if everything was all right. I told her I was sure it was. I didn't believe myself. More time passed. The house grew darker as the evening settled into night. I kept turning lights on as I moved, the soft click of switches echoing in the quiet rooms. I tried to make dinner but couldn't keep my mind on the stove. The pot of water simmered until it hissed dry, the faint smell of scorched metal drifting through the kitchen. Every sound made me look toward the window, the roll of a distant truck, a dog barking down the street, the soft thud of something shifting in the house that shouldn't have. I kept opening the front door just to look outside, letting warm, dusty air roll in while moths fluttered around the porch bulb. When Mark returned, his boots were coated in red dust, and the flashlight hung loosely in his hand. He sat down at the kitchen table without removing his hat, which told me more than any words could have. He said he'd checked the canyon road, the ridge trail, the side path by the old billboard, places Evan loved to ride. He found nothing. The wind had picked up out there, he said. It blew the dust around so much the beam of his light kept catching on empty air. He kept his sentences short, like saying too much at once might crack something open inside him. We told ourselves there were still explanations. Maybe the bike had a flat and he was walking it home. Maybe he'd stopped by someone's house and lost track of time. Maybe he'd forgotten his phone somewhere and didn't realize we were trying to reach him. We repeated these things out loud, arranging them in the air like fragile ornaments we hoped wouldn't shatter. But underneath those words, a different truth kept pushing through, the one neither of us wanted to touch. Around 10 neighbors started noticing our porch light still burning. That's how it works in a small town. People read things in your windows, Mrs. Whitaker from across the street stepped out onto her front lawn, pretending to take out a bag of trash, but she kept glancing toward our house as she tied the bag closed. A minute later, she called, asking if we needed anything, her voice carrying that tight undertone of someone bracing for bad news. I told her we were fine. She didn't believe me either. Not long after, Jason's truck rolled up, headlights bouncing once before he turned the engine off. He hopped out before the dust settled, still in his work boot shirt, damp from the day's heat. When I opened the door, he looked past me into the house as though expecting to see Evan sitting at the table drinking milk straight from the carton like he did when he thought no one was watching. He asked when we'd last seen him. Mark told him. Jason ran a hand over his hair and stared out toward the road, chewing the inside of his cheek the way he did when nerves got the best of him. He said he'd go drive the back roads near the canyon just in case. He didn't wait for us to ask. He grabbed a flashlight from his truck bed, tapped its side until the beam steadied and disappeared into the night with nothing but taillights cutting through the dust. The sound of his engine faded, leaving a strange emptiness behind. Midnight had a way of slipping up on us out there, not with cool air, but with a deeper kind of stillness. By then the town had quieted. Porch lights blinked out one by one, leaving gaps of darkness along the street. The air smelled faintly of hot earth and mesquite, and somewhere a screen door squeaked open before closing again with a hollow thud. I remember standing at the front window, my fingertips against the glass, waiting for the shape of a bike or the glimmer of a headlight to break the dark. Instead, I saw only the empty road stretching out toward the highway, lit by nothing but the moon hanging low over the plateau. I tried calling again. Voicemail. I tried again. Still voicemail. Each unanswered ring chipped away at what little calm I had left, turning my breath shallow. At some point after 1 a.m, Mark called the sheriff. He didn't pace while he talked. He stood very still, one hand on the back of a chair as though he needed the grounding. I listened to his side of the conversation, the short sentences, the careful explanations, and could hear the sheriff's measured tone coming faintly through the receiver. Standard questions. How long had he been gone? Was there a fight? Any reason he might have taken off? Mark's eyes met mine when he answered, and the way he shook his head told me the sheriff was already leaning toward the simplest explanation. After he hung up, the house grew even quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. I could hear the faint buzz of insects outside and the soft mechanical hum of the refrigerator working against the heat. Mark suggested lying down for an hour, but we both knew neither of us would sleep. We sat in the living room instead, the overhead fan ticking above us, pushing warm air around in slow circles. Every few minutes, I'd lean forward, listening hard, convinced I heard something. A bike chain rattling footsteps on the walkway, but each time it was just the creak of the house settling or the wind stirring the dry brush along the fence. By 2, the sky had gone utterly black except for the smear of stars above the ranch land. The phone remained still on the coffee table screen, dark. I couldn't stop glancing at it, waiting for it to light up with his name. When Jason returned, he stepped onto the porch, slowly boots dragging the look on his face, telling me everything before he spoke. He'd checked the ridge and the old fire road. He'd even walked part of the canyon trail with his flashlight. Nothing. No sign of him. He kept saying it like he was trying to convince himself he's probably fine. He's probably just somewhere we missed. But his eyes drifted toward the empty road, the same way mine did, heavy with doubt. The hours between 3 and 4 felt endless. The heat from the day lingered even then, the air dry enough that every breath tasted faintly of dust. I stepped outside just to cool the panic rising in my chest, the boards of the porch warm against my bare feet. The streetlight at the corner flickered once, buzzing softly. A moth tapped against the glass of the porch lamp wings, brushing in a nervous rhythm that matched the thrum in my own pulse. Nothing moved beyond that. No bike, no silhouette, no familiar stride cutting through the dark. Then, just as the first hint of dawn softened the sky, a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the street. The engine was slow, deliberate too, measured to belong to a teenager or a tired father. As it approached, the pale blue stripe along the side came into view. A sheriff's cruiser. It rolled to a stop at the curb in front of our house, gravel crackling under its tires. The deputy stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. He took off his hat and held it against his chest for a moment, looking at our porch light still burning in the gray morning. He hadn't said a word yet, but in the space between his footsteps and our doorway, the dread settled so deep in me I felt it take root. The deputy stood at the base of our porch with his hat tucked under one arm, the first thin light of dawn softening the edges of his uniform. The air still carried the warmth of the night, heavy with the smell of dust and dry grass, and for a moment none of us spoke. Mark finally stepped out beside me, his boots scraping against the wooden planks, and the deputy nodded once before asking if he could come inside. His voice was steady, almost careful, the voice of a man who'd had to deliver too many difficult words over the years. That was the moment I felt the world shift quietly like a floorboard giving underfoot. Until then, it had been our worry, our late-night pacing, our unanswered calls. But once that cruiser settled in front of our house engine ticking in the morning air, it became something larger, something official. The kind of thing that brings forms and radios and the careful language of people who know how quickly hope can thin. Inside, he listened while Mark described where he'd driven, which trails he'd checked, the corners of the canyon, where he'd called out Evan's name into the dark. The deputy jotted notes on a small pad, the scratch of his pen audible in the quiet kitchen. Sunlight edged through the curtains, lighting the steam from my coffee in a thin ribbon. I remember thinking how strange it was that the house looked exactly the same while everything inside me was changing. Within the hour, another cruiser rolled up, followed by a county truck with its emergency lights turning slow circles of red along the dim street. Neighbors stepped onto porches in their robes, arms folded against the morning air as they watched the small procession gather. A low murmur carried between houses, questions, guesses, reassurances that no one fully believed. When the deputies stepped out, radios clipped to their belts, crackling softly. I felt something tighten across my chest. The sound of those radios, the static and coded chatter, made everything feel more real than I was ready for. They spread a map across the hood of the sheriff's truck, pinning down the corners with battered flashlights. I stood a few steps away with my arms wrapped around myself, the metal scent of dew heating on the engine drifting upward. The sheriff, a broad man with weathered hands, circled his finger around the canyon area and the roads that fed into it. He spoke in short, direct phrases, search grids, likely routes, high-risk terrain, while the others nodded and traced paths with their fingertips. The canyon trail had to be checked first. Then the dry wash to the east. Then the slope behind the old billboard where tracks sometimes appeared after a storm. Volunteers started arriving not long after. Some still wore pajamas under jackets. Others had already changed into boots and work pants, faces drawn with worry. Someone brought 2 search dogs, lean animals with bright eyes tugging at their leads as they were guided toward the driveway. One of them barked once, sharp and echoing, and the sound made me flinch. A deputy handed out orange vests from the back of a truck, and the soft rustle of nylon mixed with the creak of leather belts and the clink of carabiners being clipped onto packs. Before they left, one of the deputies asked if they could borrow a shirt of Evan's for the scent. I found myself walking down the hallway toward his room, the floorboards cool beneath my bare feet. His room smelled faintly of detergent and the sweetness of old paperbacks left open on his desk. I picked up a shirt from the back of his chair, holding it for a moment before I handed it over. The dogs pressed their noses deep into the fabric, inhaling with a focus that made the hairs on my arms rise. Then the handlers gave a sharp command, and the dogs bounded toward the edge of the property, eager to work. By mid-morning, the searchers moved toward the canyon. I stayed behind at first, watching from the porch as the convoy rolled down the road trucks with dust swirling behind them, volunteers packed in mule carts and the sheriff's vehicle leading the way. The rising sun cast long shadows across the gravel, and the sound of engines faded slowly into the open land. After they were gone, the quiet around our house deepened in a way that felt unnatural, like the world had taken a step back. Mark returned briefly to check on me, dust coating the cuffs of his jeans. He ran a hand along the back of his neck, the gesture revealing more exhaustion than words could. I told him I'd come out to the canyon soon, and he nodded, though his eyes lingered on me a moment longer, as if torn between staying and going. Then he climbed back into the truck, the engine rumbling low before he pulled away. When I finally drove out myself, the road shimmered ahead in the heat. A fine layer of red dust settled onto the windshield, and every so often a gust of wind pushed tumbleweeds across the shoulder. At the canyon, pull-off clusters of volunteers gathered with radios buzzing on their hips. Deputies marked off sections with colored tape tied to mesquite branches, each fluttering softly in the hot rising breeze. The canyon looked unchanged, its ridges sharp against the sky, the dry creek bed winding through the lower basin like a faded scar. But that morning it felt heavier, as though it held its breath like the rest of us. The scent of sun-warmed stone and sagebrush filled the air. The sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow paths as teams spread out with hand signals and whispered instructions. Every so often someone would call out Evan's name, their voice swallowed by the canyon walls before it drifted back in faint, broken pieces. A deputy directed me to a shaded area near a cluster of trucks where they were collecting updates. He said they'd found nothing so far. No tire tracks, no discarded clothing. Not even a faint footprint that belonged to someone his age. The dogs had followed a scent briefly up the main trail, noses to the ground, tails stiff with purpose. But then, just as the trail reached the open plateau near the ridge, both dogs stopped. They circled, they sniffed the air. Then they sat down abruptly, confused. The scent was gone. The wind up there was strong enough to lift dust in thin spirals, and the handler suggested it might have scattered the trail. Still, the way those dogs stopped so suddenly left me unsettled long after the explanation was given. Volunteers checked the ravines next. I walked along the ridge slowly, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. Mark stood farther ahead, talking quietly with a deputy as they scanned the drop below. The searchers moved in a line spaced a few feet apart, the orange of their vests bright against the pale stone. The radio near me crackled with updates. North edge clear, no movement in the basin, checking the lower shelf now. Each report delivered with steady calm, each one quietly devastating. At one point, a shout echoed up the canyon, sharp enough to make my heart jump. A few of us hurried toward the sound dust rising around our ankles. A volunteer knelt beside something near a patch of brush. I held my breath until I saw what it was. Just a piece of torn cloth, sun-bleached and brittle. Not Evan's. The relief came quickly, followed by a wave of exhaustion so deep it left my legs weak. Later, one team returned carrying a small water bottle they'd found near the dried creek bed. My pulse quickened when I saw it, but it turned out to be from a hiker who'd passed through days before initials scratched into the plastic with a pocket knife. Another group found bike tracks, but when the sheriff compared them to the ones in old photographs of Evan's bike, he shook his head. Wrong tread, wrong width. Just another mark left by someone who rode that trail before any of this started. Rumors began forming by noon, drifting through groups of volunteers like dust in sunlight. Someone mentioned that a truck had been seen late the night before near the access road. Someone else whispered about strangers camping out past the ridge a few days earlier. A few of the older residents muttered about Harper Farm, their voices dropping when they spoke of the abandoned property and the stories that clung to it. The sheriff dismissed those worries quickly, saying the farm was too far from where Evan usually rode. Still, the way two deputies exchanged a brief look made me wonder if they were thinking the same thing I was, that sometimes the places kids go aren't the ones they talk about. As the heat grew worse, volunteers gathered beneath the thin shade of the old windmill. Bottles of warm water were passed around, the plastic soft from the sun. The air tasted like dust, leaving a faint grit on my tongue. Mark sat beside me for a moment, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the ground as though it might hold an answer he'd missed earlier. His shirt was damp with sweat patches of red dirt on his sleeves. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "We'll find him," he said. But he didn't look up when he said it, and I could hear the strain behind the words. By late afternoon, the search returned to the main clearing where all the trucks were parked. Deputies updated the map again, marking off the areas already covered. The colored lines cut across the paper in sharp angles, each one closing off another possibility. Radios continued to crackle with clipped reports. Nothing here, nothing there, moving on. The sun dipped lower, turning the canyon walls a deep rust color. Shadows stretched long across the open space, and the wind carried a soft whistle through the dry brush. As I stood near the hood of the sheriff's truck, listening to the low murmur of deputies comparing notes, a strange stillness settled over the group. One of the younger volunteers pointed toward the far ridge, squinting into the sun. A deputy lifted his binoculars, adjusting the focus slowly. His brow furrowed. He lowered the binoculars, then raised them again. Another deputy walked over, following the line of his gaze. I couldn't see what they saw, not from where I stood, but something in their posture made my heart stutter. The sheriff stepped forward, resting both hands on the map as he waited for their report. The deputy finally lowered the binoculars and turned toward him, his expression unreadable from the distance. Then his radio crackled sharply. A short message. Static. Another clipped phrase. Something found. Far side of the ridge. The deputy started walking toward us, something small held tightly in his gloved hand. And as he approached, every conversation around the clearing fell away, leaving only the wind and the faint rustle of dust slipping down the canyon wall. The young deputy reached us with that small item cupped in his gloved hand, and even before he spoke, I felt something inside me fold in on itself. The afternoon light had turned harsh by then, reflecting off the pale stone of the canyon wall and catching every particle of dust that hung in the air. He didn't look at me when he opened his hand. He looked at the sheriff instead, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. The sheriff gave a short nod, and the deputy lifted the object toward him. Only then did I see what it was: a small reflector from a bicycle pedal scratched at the edges, dulled by grit. The kind that would have fit the exact model Evan rode. The canyon seemed to exhale around us, a low sigh of heat rolling across the rocks, and something in my chest dropped heavy as a stone tossed into water. The sheriff didn't say anything right away. He just motioned for the area to be flagged, radios crackling with quick, clipped commands. Searchers shifted direction, moving in new lines across the ridge, their silhouettes stretching long in the changing light. The deputy set the reflector down on a textured evidence pad, his hands steady in a way that told me he was bracing himself for what might follow. Mark stood beside me with his arms locked across his chest, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The faint smell of hot sage drifted through the air, mixing with the metallic tang from the trucks parked nearby. Nothing else was found that evening. And as the light faded, the reflector sat alone on the hood of the sheriff's truck, catching the last red streaks of sunset like a quiet accusation. The weeks after that blurred into a long stretch of waiting, each day heavy with unanswered questions. Search teams returned for several mornings, working their way across the canyon with new angles marked on their maps, radios hissing with static and heat. But the canyon held no more answers. No torn fabric, no footprints, no sign of struggle. Just the reflector found far from where Evan should have been. Eventually, the active search tapered off. The deputies' radios grew quieter. Volunteers drifted back to their lives, and we were left with an empty house carrying the same echo of his absence every time the wind passed through the yard. 5 years went by. 5 summers of that same dry wind. 5 winters of quiet holidays with a chair that stayed empty. I won't recount those years in detail. They moved slow and colorless, marked mostly by the same routines, the same questions, the same ache that settled into the bones before morning coffee. Rumors came and went. Tips flared briefly, then fizzled. Mark kept driving the ridge trail every few weeks, dust coating the truck in a film that never quite washed off. I kept Evan's room the way it had been, sunlight falling across the same stack of books, the same jacket draped across the back of a chair. Hope didn't vanish in one moment. It thinned slowly until it was more habit than belief. Then the phone rang on a hot morning in July of 2015. a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end didn't say much, just that I needed to come to the sheriff's office and that Mark should come too. The tone alone pulled the breath from my lungs. We drove in mostly silence, the inside of the truck smelling faintly of dust and sun-warmed vinyl. The sheriff met us outside, his face carved into lines deeper than I remembered. Behind him, deputies moved with controlled urgency. Phone lines lit documents stacked, a whiteboard wheeled across the room with the ease of long practice. He told us workers clearing the old Harper farm had uncovered something. A slab had cracked, a well had opened. Crews had looked down and seen shapes that were not debris. It felt like the world narrowed. Then the sheriff's voice dropping into a low hum, drowned out by the rush of blood in my ears. I remember gripping Mark's arm until my fingers ached. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the heat, their rising drone somehow indifferent to the earth shifting beneath us. He didn't confirm anything yet. He said they needed time. He said the site was being secured. But a mother knows. There are moments that don't require words. Later that afternoon, they allowed us as close to the farm perimeter as safety allowed. Yellow tape snapped against the wind, stretched between metal stakes driven into cracked dirt. Floodlights stood ready, though they weren't yet turned on. Investigators in white suits moved carefully around the mouth of the well, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. The air there had a different feel, a faint coolness rising from underground, carrying the scent of damp stone and something older, untouched by sunlight for decades. I stood a few yards back, the ground beneath my shoes, soft with loose soil, and watched as they lowered a camera on a tether, its small light disappearing into the black throat of the shaft. Every now and then the rope twitched and the technician murmured updates I could not hear. Another investigator noted measurements on a clipboard, her hair tucked beneath a hood, her face set in that professional stillness that comes from years of training. The sheriff stepped away to take a call. Voice low, back turned. Mark stayed beside me, arm firm across my shoulders, though I could feel the tremor he tried to hide. Near sunset, they began bringing items up in padded baskets, small fragments at first, each handled with solemn care. I knew before the sheriff reached us with the first personal item. It was the weight of his steps, the way he held the evidence pouch with both hands. Inside was a metal belt buckle, tarnished but intact. I recognized it instantly. It had been part of Evan's favorite belt, the one he'd worn nearly every day that summer. My knees weakened and Mark's hand found mine without him looking. The sheriff didn't speak. He didn't need to. The next morning brought the official identification. They asked us to come in quietly through the back entrance of the county building. The hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper. In a small room, they laid out the items found in the well, each one photographed, cataloged, sealed. The sight of them struck something deep inside me, a silent devastation that settled like cold iron in my stomach. A scrap of faded fabric, a rusted zipper pull, and then the item that would change the course of everything, a battered pocket knife. The blade snapped, the handle scratched. I didn't recognize the knife. But the moment I said so, I saw a flicker in the detective's eyes, confirmation that this was as important to them as it was confusing to me. Later, they told us whose knife it likely was. Not Evan's, not Mark's. It belonged to the friend who had grown so quiet years earlier, the one who used to sit at our kitchen counter talking about canyon trails and late-night rides. They said his name with care, knowing what it meant. The ground seemed to shift under my feet again. In the days that followed, the truth began to unfold in fragments, interviews, records, recollections from people who had spent years living with shadows they didn't know how to name. Deputies visited the Miller home several times. The sheriff conducted long conversations behind closed doors, emerging each time with a face that looked more weathered than the last. Eventually, the father spoke, then the son. The details were halting at first, then clearer. It had been an accident, they said. A group of boys venturing onto old farm property where they shouldn't have been. A loose rock at the lip of a forgotten well. A fall too sudden for anyone to stop. Panic, fear, and then a decision terrible, irreversible to cover the truth rather than face it. The father had moved the belongings, had covered the well, had sworn the boys to silence. The words were delivered in quiet tones, without cruelty, but they landed with the force of a life forever altered. When the confession was complete, the sheriff asked if we wanted a moment alone in the room. I couldn't speak, so Mark answered for both of us. The walls felt close, the hum of the air conditioner impossibly loud. I stared at the table where the file sat open, its pages heavy with statements and signatures that could not be undone. I felt hollow, as though grief had carved out a space too deep for breath. The farm was sealed off for several days afterward. Crews worked under bright lights late into the night, processing every inch of the site. Soil samples were taken, structural diagrams sketched, the well measured with tools that beeped softly in the darkness. Each sound echoed across the empty property, blending with the low whine of insects rising from the grass. We held each other up through those days, Mark and I, though neither of us slept much. The sheriff called us back for briefings, his voice thick with fatigue. A prosecutor arrived from the district office, her heels clicking softly across the station floor as she laid out the next steps. Papers were drafted, charges prepared, court dates scheduled. The rhythm of it all moved with a brisk certainty that felt at odds with the slow, stunned grief settling over us. One night, as we were leaving the station, I paused in the doorway. Down the hallway, a single fluorescent bulb flickered, humming in the stillness. A deputy carried a box of case files past us. His shoulders slumped under the weight. Outside, reporters were gathering across the street, adjusting cameras under the sodium lights, while they rehearsed quiet sentences to the unseen viewers who would hear them by morning. That was the night I understood the full measure of what lay ahead. Not just the truth we'd been handed, but the long, difficult road that would follow the hearings, the testimony, the questions asked in hushed tones by neighbors trying to make sense of something senseless. The courthouse would open its doors to this story. Reporters would prepare their scripts. Lawyers would sort through evidence laid out beneath harsh lights. And all we could do was step into that next chapter, carrying the weight of what had finally been pulled from the dark. In the days after they brought Evan's remains up from the well, the world around us moved with a strange combination of urgency and hush. Deputies came and went from our house, their radios whispering in low bursts as they tried to keep their voices from carrying across the neighborhood. The sheriff stopped by every morning, always taking his hat off before he spoke, as if setting it aside helped soften the weight of whatever update he had to deliver. I remember the smell of dust and disinfectant clinging to his uniform. A reminder of the long nights his team spent at that farm combing the ground inch by inch. Neighbors left casseroles on the porch, unsure if they should knock, unsure what to say if we opened the door. I could feel their eyes following us gently when we stepped outside, sympathy mingled with shock, the kind of quiet people hold when they realize the worst possibility has become real. The Miller family kept to themselves during those first days, their curtains drawn, their yard deserted. Word spread quickly through Mesa Creek. Small towns breathed through rumor as much as oxygen. Folks whispered in the aisles of the grocery store, their voices dipping when I walked by. Some were angry, some confused, and some spoke with a sadness that surprised me, mourning not just Evan, but the weight they imagined Jason must have carried all those years. But most people simply didn't know what to do with the truth that had finally surfaced. For 5 summers, many had convinced themselves Evan had run away or that he was somewhere out there waiting to be found. Learning that he'd been only a few miles from home the whole time, buried under concrete, poured in fear hit them in a way I don't think any of us could have prepared for. The legal process moved forward almost immediately. Detectives finished their interviews and the district attorney laid out the charges against Jason's father. We attended the early hearings, sitting in wooden benches, polished smooth by decades of use. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper and old varnish, and the hum of the air conditioner seemed too loud in the otherwise still room. When the prosecutor recited the timeline, Evan's fall, the panic, the staged bicycle, the slab poured over the well, I felt each detail pass through me like cold air. The defense spoke about fear about a man making a terrible choice in a moment he couldn't undo. I listened without anger, without forgiveness. Just an odd, hollow sense that nothing said in that room could return what we had lost. Jason was present at each hearing, sitting with his hands folded in his lap, shoulders drawn inward as if he were trying to disappear into himself. He didn't look at us, though. Once, when the judge called for a short recess, he let his eyes drift in our direction. There was a lifetime of regret in that single glance, and something else, too relief, maybe, that the secret he'd carried alone for so long was finally out in the open. I didn't approach him. I didn't trust myself to speak. But in that moment I sensed a young man who had been just as trapped by that night as we had been by the years that followed. The trial itself was brief. Evidence was clear. Intent was absent. The charges focused on the cover-up, not the fall itself. When the sentence was handed down, community service supervision, financial restitution, I felt no surge of satisfaction, no disappointment either. It was simply the closing of a chapter that had already taken more from us than a court could measure. Mark squeezed my hand as the judge finished reading, his fingers cool against mine, his breath steady, even as mine trembled. After the trial, the county moved quickly to secure abandoned wells across the region. Crews marked dangerous sites with bright flags and posted warning signs on old properties that had been ignored for too long. The Harper Farm well was filled and leveled, the soil smoothed over until it looked no different from the land around it. I didn't go out there again. I didn't need to. That place had taken enough. In Mesa Creek, life resumed its small rhythms, though the town didn't settle the same way it once had. People became more careful. Kids stopped exploring the far edges of old farmland. Parents asked more questions, checked in more often. At the diner, conversations lowered to a murmur whenever someone mentioned the canyon or the farm. There was a collective sense of reckoning and understanding that in towns like ours, even abandoned places carry a kind of responsibility. For us, rebuilding was slow. Mark went back to work after a while, though he moved through his days with a heaviness that never fully lifted. He kept Evan's bike in the garage cleaned and oiled, standing upright beside his own tools. I think it gave him something to tend to, a small piece of fatherhood he wasn't ready to let go of. I returned to routines little by little, folding laundry, tending the small garden by the porch, sitting with neighbors who brought quiet company more than conversation. Yet every evening, when the sun dropped low and shadows stretched across the yard, the stillness settled on me in a way that reminded me of that first night, light burning on the porch road. Empty air, warm and restless. We held Evan's memorial service in a simple white church near the edge of town. The floorboards smelled of pine and old candles, and the stained glass windows cast muted colors across the pews. His friends came, some with children of their own, now their voices softer as they spoke of the boy. They remembered the long bike rides, the laughter that came easier around those he trusted, the quiet strength they saw in him, even when he didn't see it in himself. Jason sent a handwritten letter, a short one. Careful, honest. I didn't share its contents with anyone. Some things belong to the heart, not the record. In the years since I've found that grief doesn't disappear, it changes shape. Some days it feels like a stone in my pocket, heavy, familiar, pressed close. Other days it rises unexpectedly. A rush of memory when the wind sweeps over the plain just right, or when I hear the soft jangle of a bicycle chain somewhere in town. I've learned to let those moments come and go without fighting them. They are reminders, not wounds. Mesa Creek has quiet seasons now. Summers are still hot enough to melt the horizon, and the canyon still carries that long echo when you call into it. But the town listens differently. People notice when a porch light burns too long. They pause when they see a bicycle left against a fence after dark. Our story became part of the town's bones, passed gently between generations, as a lesson, a warning, and in some ways, a tribute to a boy who wanted nothing more than a bit of quiet on a summer afternoon. As for me, I keep one of Evan's notebooks on the living room shelf. Inside, on a page near the back, he'd written a small list that summer, things he wanted to learn, places he wanted to write, a book he meant to borrow from the school library. The ink has faded, a little edges curled from years of handling. Some evenings I run my fingers over his handwriting, tracing the gentle pressure of each letter, feeling closer to him in those small strokes than in any memorial or court record. There's a moment from those early days that still returns to me. The quiet after the sheriff left our porch, just before dawn, broke fully. I remember stepping outside alone, the boards cool beneath my feet, the sky a soft blue-gray. The road in front of our house was empty, stretching toward the plateau with not a single movement. And yet something in that silence felt absolute, like a truth waiting patiently beneath the surface of the world. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Some absences never release their grip. They settle into the spaces where words falter, and they stay with you long after the world has moved on. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.